So good afternoon for people who are joining us. I'm just going to wait as people are coming in into the webinar, and then we'll get underway. So I can just see a number of participants who are joining us. So making sure that people are there. All right. Well, I guess other people will join as we get underway. So good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. This webinar will be in English, even though the University of Ottawa is a bilingual institution. Donc je me présente, Patrick. I'm introducing myself, Patrick Leblond. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Also the holder of the CN-Tellier chair. So I'm the host of this webinar where I will present a report. And I'm also very honored to have three special guests, discussants, who will discuss and comment and improve this report that I am about to present on digital trade strategy for Canada. So first, I have Susan Aronson, who is the research professor and also director of the Susan, it's Digital Trade and Governance Hub, right?
Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub.
And Data Governance Hub. So if I'm now working on digital trade, it's thanks to Susan, who got me interested in this topic. And she's certainly one of the world's foremost experts on the topic. So we're very happy to have you, Susan. Next, we have Robert Asselin, who is a Senior Vice President Policy at the Business Council of Canada. Bonjour Robert, bienvenue.
Bonjour, merci.
And finally, but none the least, we have Chantal Bernier, who is with Dentons, and she's the co-head of, now I forgot my notes, unfortunately, but basically everything cyber at Dentons over the world. She's also a former commissioner for privacy commissioner for the government of Canada. And I should also mention, while we're at it, that Chantal is honorary senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And Robert is a former associate director of the graduate school. So we're, you know, you might say that I went easy and got friends on board to discuss the report. But I trust my companions to, you know, be frank enough and tell me what they think. And certainly, you know, they're all experts in their domains and will add a lot to the discussion, I'm sure. So what I'm planning to do, the way this will work is that first, since this is a report that I have done with the support of the Business Council of Canada, basically outlining a digital trade strategy for Canada. So I will present the main elements of this report. So in a way, what is this digital trade strategy for Canada? And then Susan, Robert, and Chantal will make opening remarks. So in a way, their first impressions on what's there and what's probably also missing, what should be, you know, how it fits in terms of their respective expertise and perspectives. And then we'll have more of a discussion among ourselves to continue. And then towards the end, about 15 minutes, 20 minutes before, we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, please share them. You have a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So put your questions in there. And then I will go and take a look, and then we'll mention that and take your questions towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so let me share my screen so that you have a sense of what a digital trade strategy for Canada should look like, at least according to me. There we go. All right. So the whole notion here is that there is a report and a policy brief that I started sharing yesterday by email until the University of Ottawa thought that I was sending spam and has now blocked my account. So hopefully I can start sharing it soon. It should be available online soon. Unfortunately, we're transitioning to a new platform, so it's making things a bit complicated. Anyways, if you want to read it now, send me an email. I can still receive emails, and then I'll send you a copy or copies in either French or English or both, if you wish, using my personal email address. That's how we're functioning right now, given some of the digital constraints that we're facing. So even in 2022, as I mentioned outright, this is a collaboration with the Business Council of Canada. They provided financial and publication support. So in terms of publication, they kindly offered translation and formatting of the report. So I certainly want to underline this collaboration, which is very important. And in terms of the report itself, there are 19 recommendations. In the report, they are to be found on page 4, and in the policy brief, which is a summary of the report, they are found in the appendix. I won't go through each recommendation in this presentation. I want it to be short. I want to give you, in a way, this presentation is meant as a teaser, so that you go and read the brief and ideally even the report to see all the good stuff that is in there. But I'll be mentioning in a way the logic of how the recommendations are organized. So let's talk about context, in a way, why this report, why this need of a digital trade strategy for Canada. Well, I think I don't really need to convince anyone that digitalization and digital trade are growing in importance, right? We live in a world that is increasingly digital. I think just the fact that we are having this webinar, if you remember a few years back, webinars were not something that people did that much. They were starting, but very marginal. And nowadays, they're ubiquitous. And in a way, they're a wonderful way to get together when it's not possible to do so physically. Even now, as in-person events are coming back online, if I can use that term. So obviously, the whole notion of a strategy is always to support something that is seen as good for businesses and the overall economy. However, when certainly I was doing research for this report, for Canada's digital trade performance, surprisingly, was below its economic size. In a way, Canada is underperforming. And that might be a bit of a surprise. And one of the reasons is that the adoption of information communication technology is relatively low in Canada. And again, some of the reasons behind that would be the not enough skill talent to take advantage of these technologies, weaknesses in terms of digital infrastructure. Canada is catching up, but maybe not fast enough. Regulatory clarity, which we'll talk about. And something that I'm sure Robert will talk about, because he's written a lot about this, is the whole notion of the scaling up of small and medium-sized enterprises, innovation, intellectual property, all these things that matter a lot when we talk about digital trade. And this is something where Canada certainly needs to do more, and there are a lot of ideas, and I'm sure Robert will talk about that later. And finally, when one looks at policies regarding digital trade, whether it's trade agreements, whether it's data protection and privacy protection, AI, it's not clear that it's all the approach, whether it's from the government of Canada or even the provinces, that it's done in a coherent way. Sometimes there is this feeling that things kind of each one is doing things on their own without necessarily linking to what other parts of the policy system is doing. So I will also, the report does talk about that, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. So just to give you a sense of where Canada is. So first of all, I should say that data on digital trade is still emerging. It's a new domain where statistical agencies are trying to grasp and figure out how to measure digital trade properly. The report that discusses those things quite at length so that you can understand the limits and what it means, even questions of definition. How does one define digital trade and what that is? So here, in terms of what the UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, they talk about e-commerce sales, and you can see that Canada is not even in the top 10. Right, at least according to the latest data in 2019, behind countries, surprisingly, Spain and Australia. We can, okay, maybe the US, Japan, France, bigger economies than Canada, but the fact that countries or economies like Spain and Australia are ahead of Canada in terms of overall sales, percentage of GDP. So these are certainly a big, big surprise, at least when I was looking at this, that we were not even in the top 10 when it comes to business to business digital trade. In terms of business to consumer, Canada is in the top 10. But again, there are smaller economies that are, have a bigger proportion of their digital trade, either that is bigger than Canada, and again, perhaps surprising given the wealth and size of the Canadian economy. So obviously things are not bad, but the expectation would be that the Canadian economy should be higher when it comes to digital trade, especially when Canada is one of the countries that has the highest penetration of the internet. So the expectation should be that we should be up there, but we're not. So that means we should do more. We can do more, and that's the whole logic behind this strategy. One finding, and this is obviously an important element at the core of this strategy and the analysis, is the fact that information and communication technologies are important for growing international trade, and that's based on a 2018 WTO report from the World Trade Organization that shows quite clearly how ICTs reduce trade costs, how they create trade, they support trade, they create business opportunities, they make it easier for SMEs to do business internationally. So in a way, if performance in terms of ICT adoption is not as high as at least expected or should be, or if we can increase it, then it should also accompany more digital trade. So in a way, if you can see here, this is a graph from a study by Statistics Canada, and you can see that in overall, Canadian businesses, on average, it's less than 50% make use of information and communication technologies. Overall, StatsCan says that 87% of Canadian businesses, at least those surveyed, use one of these information and communication technologies. But as you can see, overall, about it's 50% of businesses that use these ones specific. But then if you look at more advanced type of ICTs, you can see that the level of penetration or adoption is very low, right? And even more common ones like CRM or EDI, still around 10-15%, which is not very high. Obviously, if we could increase those numbers, it would help a lot to support and ultimately lead to digital trade. And a lot of the strategy will focus on how we can increase ICT adoption and use by Canadian businesses. So the digital trade strategy for Canada rests on 3 pillars, and you'll probably look at those and say, well, it's fairly obvious, and yes, the 3 pillars are kind of a way to organize the strategy and where Government of Canada, provinces, the business community should work together to really improve and Canada's digital trade performance ultimately. And those three pillars are in terms of digital infrastructure, so extending it, upgrading it, securing it. Cybersecurity is, as we know, is increasingly important. So it's important to have a secure digital infrastructure, and we'll see what that looks like shortly. Enhancing Canada's digital capacity. So it's nice to have the infrastructure, right? But we also need to have people who are able to use it, right? So having faster internet or easier modes of digital payments, you still need people who are able to use those, to use information and telecommunication technologies, right? So in a way, skills, knowledge, how to develop that ultimately into services or marketing, these kinds of things. So digital capacity is equally important. And finally, the logic is, well, okay, once we have the capacity, once we have the infrastructure, how do we get Canadian products and services abroad? And that's where working to remove barriers to international digital trade are important. So quickly, Pillar 1, extending, upgrading, and securing Canada's digital infrastructure. So, Canadian businesses should have access to affordable, reliable, secure, and inclusive, high-quality digital infrastructure. So that's telecommunications and payments. And obviously, it's in terms of telecommunications and high-speed internet, it's often an issue outside of urban areas. We know that, yes, high-speed internet has been increasing in those areas, but it's still the reliability, the speed remains probably not as good as what is needed to fully engage in digital trade around the world for either individuals or businesses operating in those regions. So work is being done, but more needs to be done. The same for payments, to facilitate digital payments in Canada, but certainly when going abroad, and make sure that it is affordable. It's one of another challenge that Canadian businesses, and not only Canadian businesses, a lot of the things that are found in the context of Canada, I'm sure apply to other countries, right? And then finally, if we're talking about infrastructure, we have to make sure that it interconnects cheaply and easily and reliably and securely with our partners, right? We can have the best infrastructure in Canada, but then if we can't connect with the rest of the world, then that becomes a problem. So we have to work on that too. In terms of digital capacity, the adoption, the development, the protection. So if we're talking, yes, securing, but also sometimes in terms of intellectual property, the establish and advance information and communication technology. So to a larger extent than we have done so far, and then focusing on, make sure the Canadian workers, managers, entrepreneurs have the skills and knowledge necessary to make the best use of those technologies, right? So skills of a technical nature, knowledge of cybersecurity, intellectual property, AI, data protection, all these things where workers, managers, and entrepreneurs need to know, and also softer skills. It's very different to operate digitally in terms of sales, marketing, product management, or even problem resolution than it is to do so in person. So those skills also have to be adapted. And then finally, the third pillar, removing barriers to international digital trade. Certainly the government of Canada has been working very hard in terms of signing on to and negotiating international trade agreements, whether it's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on a Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. Those agreements have chapters on digital trade that is supposed to make digital trade easier. In the report, I do talk about some of the uncertainty around the effectiveness of those provisions, those chapters, but certainly the idea here is that Canadian businesses should face minimal barriers to international digital trade. So whether it's in form of taxation, there's talk about imposing taxes on digital activities, and also then non-tariff barriers, so regulatory barriers whether it's to protect data, whether it's to do data localization, for instance, or forcing companies to keep their data in a particular jurisdiction, or sometimes even their whole computing equipment needs to be localized. So these are all types of barriers to digital trade. And certainly, again, talking about cooperation between different levels of governments, but also with the business community. This is not the type of strategy that falls onto one government or just the private sector. It has to be a collaborative approach if we are going to achieve the kind of objectives that we are looking for. And obviously, we need to cooperate with partners abroad who, in a way, face the same challenges if we are to have kind of global rules that will facilitate digital trade. To conclude, and this is kind of an important element in the report as part of the strategy, at least to get things going and keep them going, is what I call the first step, or the next step, is to create a Canadian Digital Policy Council. So right now, as mentioned, there's a big question about coherence and coordination. Even with whether it's within the government of Canada or with the business community, or even with provinces that are operating in that sphere, and I know Chantal will talk about it. There has to be somewhere a body, not someone, but people who are responsible, or at least a body that is responsible for this strategy, for making sure that it gets implemented, that does follow up. Because it's one thing to adopt a strategy, someone say, government of Canada say, oh, this is a great strategy, we're going to adopt it. But then what? Who's going to be responsible for actually making it happen? And how do we ensure that there is a kind of collaboration between the public, private sector, civil society that is needed to make this strategy happen and make it happen in the right way for Canadian society and economy? Because it's not just the economic side, right? There's a whole issue of how do we protect data? How do we protect people's privacy? How do we ensure cybersecurity? And in some cases, these regulations might actually make things more difficult when it comes to doing business either within Canada or with our partners. So there has to be this very strong cooperation. So here, some of the roles for this Canadian Digital Policy Council, which should be a permanent thing, not a task force that comes and goes, but something that should be permanent, that should have official responsibilities with budgets and resources to really make this happen. And also in terms of transparency, I think it's important that there should be transparency in terms of what kind of progress are being made. It's being made with such a strategy. What are the results? So that businesses, people know, and then there can be adaptation. Because obviously, digitalization, digital economy, data-driven economy is not going to go away. For the foreseeable future, things will change. Technology is evolving very rapidly. So as a result, we need people who are able to follow this, who are able to make recommendations, who keep, in a way, our political and business leaders focused on that issue, because it's so easy to get sidetracked by the fire of the moment, that then you lose the long-term perspective. And a lot of this requires long-term thinking and policies and programs that will not yield necessarily immediate results, but results in the future. So it's really, in a nutshell, kind of a presentation of the report entitled A Digital Strategy for Canada. So I invite you to read at a minimum the policy brief, if not the whole report. But at least hopefully I've given you enough of a teaser that you will go and do so. All right, so thank you for listening to the presentation. So I'd like to, first I'll turn to Robert, who has written a lot on Canada's innovation policy, the intangible economy, and Robert will, is kindly offered to offer a more macro perspective on a digital trade strategy for Canada. So Robert.
Merci beaucoup, Patrick. Merci beaucoup, Patrick. Thanks everyone for joining. Congratulations on the report. We're delighted to be helping, putting together. Patrick, great work, very comprehensive. I think I'd like to just focus my remarks, very brief remarks today, on kind of three big picture observations. And those observations basically are in the context of where does digital trade policy, digital trade future fit into our trade policy framework in general. So the first comment I would make, and I think it'll be obvious for most people who are on this webinar, is that the source of where economic growth comes from is changing rapidly. And we're increasingly living in what I called, and what has been called by many, into a more intangible economy, where obviously data, IP, intellectual capital in general are driving economic wealth, economic growth generally in the world. If you look, for example, at the S&P 500 in the United States, for example, the 500 most capitalized public companies listed there, you clearly see the shift in the value for intangible assets, and it's growing. And so this has broad policy implications for countries such as ours. And I would argue that we've been slow. We're still being slow to move to this new reality of where economic growth is coming from. That's the first observation. The second observation, and I don't mean to be too much of a downer, but I think we have to be frank with ourselves, is that our trade competitiveness in general is on a downward track. I think it's an important observation to make. In fact, I would argue if you look at the last 20 years, our exports have risen only at just about half of the pace of our overall economy, which is daunting, I would suggest. And despite the fact that we've signed a lot of trade agreements, and we're obviously very supportive of those with key partners, think about TPP, CETA, even more general bilateral trade deal, the US remained obviously the beneficiary of about 3/4 of our goods export. And that's about the same as 30 years ago. So I would say that on our trade competitiveness, we have to realize where we are. I would also note that our share of the US market over the last few years, last decade actually, has actually declined. And when you look at the composition of the trade we're doing, it's mostly natural resources, obviously auto parts, and we're not a major advanced technological supplier of DES, nor are we a supplier of tech for most of our allies. I think this needs to change, especially in the context of very aggressive industrial policy in the US. You will have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and the Science Act. I believe those are it's probably the biggest game changer on industrial policy since the Cold War and President Kennedy Apollo's program in the 60s. So I think we have to be very frank on our trade competitiveness, and it speaks to our general competitiveness in general as a country. And when we think about industrial policy, innovation policy, what are our objectives? I think those are really ill-defined in Canada. In my view, it is clear it has to be around productivity and competitiveness. And we have to address this business investment problem that is caused, in my view, to many factors, but the main ones being we remain, unfortunately, mainly an SME economy, and Patrick has mentioned this. We have a scaling issue. And second, a composition of our economy is mostly around, unfortunately, consumption, real estate, increasingly, as opposed to productive, advanced industries where we can compete globally. The last comment I'll make, last observation, is something again that may sound obvious, but I think is really important, is that the political economy of trade is going to get trickier as we move forward, especially for a trading nation such as Canada. So when you look at the US-China decoupling, and you've witnessed the latest example with President Biden ban announcement on China chips, I think those are very significant. You will also have probably heard about Minister's Freeland's speech at Brookings Institution that took, I think, good note of these structural change, but we should not minimize the path forward. And I think it'll be much more challenging than most people assume. We're not going to deglobalize the world economy with a few protectionist moves. So just in closing, I think there are three key drivers going forward when one thinks about trade competitiveness. One is national security. That's a huge driver. We've seen it, we live it. The second is technological innovation. And the third is IP creation and retention. And I would argue on these three key drivers, Canada has to shake itself up. I think we're doing very poorly. We have to be much better at it. Thank you, Patrick.
Merci, Robert. Susan?
Thank you, and hi, everybody. So my perspective on this will be a bit different. I'm going to focus on trust, the role of the public, and data. And I guess my perspective is going to be different in this regard too. That I think Patrick is right on target in terms of his focus on infrastructure and capacity. Clearly, those are things that, Canada, having been the inventor of machine learning, investing so much money in AI research and capacity, these are things that Canada is great at, and yet it's not, again, our statistics are terrible. We use proxies to measure digital trade, and they are garbage proxies. So we really don't know this. We need to be honest about that. But what worries me is that I'm going to speak generically, not just to what Patrick is saying, but to me, to have an effective digital strategy, it has to be built on trust among market actors, right? And it has to be meshed with a data strategy, which Canada does not have, but 12 other nations, such as the UK, do. And what I mean is, Canada does not have a strategy that delineates the role of data in the economy and the polity. So that's the first thing. And I think that's one reason why Canada is a little bit flailing here, because it thinks about data as personal data, but it doesn't really get to the potential of data as both a commercial asset, which clearly it is, but it also is a public good, and a public good that is both national and international. Okay. Patrick talked about creating a policy council, but I still think if you want to build trust, you have to involve the broader public, and AI gives us a tool to do so. We need more dialogue among not just the organized public and interest groups, but individual members who are frightened by the change to digitalization and to a great extent are threatened by it and don't understand it. Now, Canada is not alone, but in the trade agreements that Canada seems to be most interested in, such as DIPA, and I'm not really dissing DIPA, but it doesn't really address special requirements for emerging tech. And what I mean by that is Internet of Things, data trust, encryption. Yes, it does address encryption and source code protection. You can't demand it as a condition of operation, but it doesn't really talk about how you avoid protectionism in this area. And I don't mean just data sovereignty. Data spaces, data sharing. These are the issues coming up right now, and yet no trade agreement addresses it. Canada could lead, but it's not. Canada, to its credit, is a great supporter of multilateralism and the JSI. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago that showed Canada was way out front in terms of trying to build common ground and make suggestions. What is Canada going to do if the JSI fails at the WTO? And it is likely to fail from what people tell me. I don't think DIPA is going to be sufficient. So I think Canada needs to be thinking about where do we go from there, right? I think DIPA could be an alternative, but is Canada ready to think about that? Another question, the TC is where the US and the EU are working together on a common policy. The United States, to its discredit, does not seem to be treating Canada as the beloved partner it should. And I think, why is Canada not in the TTC? It should be there. And it should be taking a leadership role. So let me summarize by saying Patrick has nailed the particulars in terms of the digital trade strategy for Canada. But I think trust, the role of the public, the role of emerging technologies, and just anticipating where this is going, Canada is falling behind. It doesn't seem to get data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your perspective and a little bit like Robert, broadening it to key and important issues that are obviously related to digital trade, but are not just about digital trade. That's one of the challenges when we talk about the digital economy and digital trade is, there's not clear boundaries between all these things, right? And Robert was also, in a way, I think that's what I understood from Robert's comments about, like, the nature of how we do business and how we trade and is changing, and we need to be very clear about that. And I think, Susan, you've made that clear also in terms of data and how important it is, and then the different types of datas and how do you govern them and how do you share them. So again, there are lots of issues there, and thank you so much for using, in a way, the reports to expand on these questions, because obviously the report, in the end, is no way to be comprehensive about these issues. But we as we go forward, these are things that are important, and thinking about a strategy for sure, and certainly in the broader digital economy. So on that, I'll turn to Chantal, who I'm sure will address a lot of these issues also, certainly from her perspective. Chantal, s'il te plaît.
Merci, Patrick. So indeed, I am going to address the points that Robert and Susan made, sort of like a cross-cutting, in the sense that as a privacy lawyer and a global one, Dentons is the largest law firm in the world. Of course, I'm going to address Robert's point about digital trade in its international context. And I would also like to build upon Susan's point in relation to how Canada addresses the potential of data. So in fact, listening to them, I have added to what I had seen reading your report as really the pillars in relation to privacy law to support digital trade. Robert and Susan made me see even more points, if we can say touch points, between privacy and the support to digital trade. Like Robert and Susan, your report totally resonates with me. In particular, recommendation 4A, where you link the protection of data, personal data, to the expansion of digital trade. And going back to Robert's point about putting digital trade in its context of international agreements, you specifically attach this argument to the General Data Protection Regulation and Canada's adequacy status. And indeed, totally agree, the fact that Canadian companies that are regulated by the Federal Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, called for short PIPEDA, the fact that all of those companies can receive personal data from Europe, and this includes the EEA, not just the EU, without further authorization, really smooths out the regulatory context for international trade, going, I believe, to Robert's point and yours, that is a factor that consolidates Canada's position in relation to digital trade. I would go further than that. First of all, you say in your report that federal legislation to modernize PIPEDA, which is actually introduced indeed to maintain our adequacy with the GDPR, because right now we do not have the enforcement measures that the Europeans want us to have. So you suggest that it has to be adopted by the fall, in the fall of 2022, or we could lose adequacy status. In my very modest opinion, I think the Europeans will wait for us. Robert mentioned CETA a moment ago. I think the context of CETA, Canada is a favorite partner of the EU. I believe that since legislation to beef up PIPEDA is currently in the House of Commons, I think the European Commission will go soft on us in the sense that it will give us the time to adopt changes to PIPEDA and therefore review our adequacy status on the basis of that legislation, this new legislation, and prolong it. That's sort of what I see. Now, going back then to the pillars that I see to support privacy protection, which indeed supports digital trade. The first one, you've mentioned it, Patrick, is cybersecurity. So what are we doing on that? Well, since September 22, this year, we have in Quebec mandatory breach notification. We had that under the federal law since 2018, adopted in 2015, came into force 2018. We had that in Alberta for many years. Now, Quebec also has mandatory breach notification. That's part of cybersecurity. Also, the new Quebec Privacy Act, which modernizes its current act respecting the protection of personal information in the private sector, also is much clearer on what organizations must do to protect personal information. So this goes to your point about cybersecurity. Then we have Bill C-26, which only applies to organizations under federal jurisdiction, but still is precisely aimed at reinforcing Canada's cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. And then we have Bill C-27 that I mentioned a moment ago that modernizes PIPEDA, that doesn't really beef up PIPEDA in relation to cybersecurity, but PIPEDA already had mandatory breach notification, still introducing, like Quebec, multi-million-dollar fines for breaches of personal information, I believe goes to strengthening the cybersecurity framework. So that's pillar number one, cybersecurity. The second pillar is accountability. We have to make organizations accountable for the personal data they hold. And that is beefed up again in the new Quebec legislation, which now does what it didn't do before, require organizations to appoint someone to be in charge of the protection of personal information. And if they don't, well, then the person in highest authority is the person in charge. And to also adopt a privacy program. That exists already at the federal level. That did not exist in the Quebec privacy law until this modernization. That goes to accountability. But the new privacy law that is tabled before the House of Commons, Bill C-27, also does reinforce governance by also adding to written records of assessments of privacy impact assessments. We should really expect this to go forward. And those written records of privacy impact assessments will help us keep organizations accountable. The third pillar is the limitation of use of personal information by companies and private organizations. So what we call surveillance capitalism. So basically data accumulation, the following, tracking on the internet of all of our activities by organizations that seek to advertise to us. That is addressed by CASL, the Canada Anti-Spam legislation, which I see you were a victim of a few days, obviously by mistake. But anyway, the point is it exists and it is meant precisely to rein in advertising online because it applies to commercial electronic messages. But there's another way in which we are consolidating our regulatory framework around that, and that is with the new Quebec Act and Bill C-27 that is in the House of Commons, beefing up, tightening the conditions of consent. A lot more will require express consent. A lot less will be allowed without consent. Okay, so that in itself is relevant. Then there is the fifth pillar, which is state surveillance. We have to make sure that the state is kept away from personal information online as it is kept away from personal information in the offline world. The same rules apply. And so we already have, Canada has a very strict framework on that. The companies cannot go and get willy-nilly personal information from the companies that have online data. And it was even confirmed in 2014, Supreme Court of Canada said clearly, IP address is personal information. In fact, it's sensitive personal information because it's a key, not just to who the subscriber is, but to subscribers' allegiances, political opinions, interests, in fact, the mind. And so we're quite strong there, but that is certainly something where at every turn, we're going to have to make sure, for example, when we adopt legislation trying to rein in harmful content online. Yeah, great purpose, but we're going to have to make sure that it's not at the expense of privacy online. And finally, listening to Susan, I add a sixth pillar, and that is liberating the data. If I understood you well, Susan, what I heard was that we have a treasure trove of data. Yes, we need to protect privacy, but we need to find an ethical, privacy protective way to optimize that data. You mentioned data trust. I am a huge fan of data trusts. And I do believe that indeed, that is really the challenge before us. The one that is really emerging is, how do we regulate a privacy protective path to this treasure trove of personal data to optimize it for the public good? Bill C-37 does have a provision that foresees the use of personal data for social beneficial purposes. The Ontario White Paper on an Ontario privacy law mentions the possibility of adopting provisions on data trusts. So there is thinking in that direction, but definitely I agree with Susan that that is an area that we need to go more deeply in.
Thank you very much. Merci, Chantal. Great points, and certainly lots of things to think about in this area when it comes to, in a way, the regulatory environment around digital trade. Chantal, and this, in a way, I want to open up the discussion to everyone now. But Chantal's comments and points obviously were focused on Canada. But one of the questions, and certainly this is something that the report kind of addresses, obviously very only touching the surface. But the big challenge here, and I'm not saying that we have a solution, but I think it's something worth thinking about and discussing. And certainly from your vantage points, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. But all these things that need to be governed or regulated. Whether now Chantal just talked about liberating the data, which Susan introduced. State surveillance. We know that in a way, state surveillance is a huge issue for data transfers between the US and the EU, the European Union, right? For many years, the US has tried to have this agreement, whether, it's the latest incarnation was the Privacy Shield. Now it seems like they've reached some kind of agreement, but, the main concern by the European Union Court of Justice was state surveillance, right? Like the government basically going and getting information on people and businesses and all that, and without really kind of transparency and regulations. And the EU was very concerned and said, well, no, we're not going to allow, we're not going to give adequacy certainly to the US for that. Harmful content, accountability. So all these things, privacy protection. So in all these domains, yes, the free market doesn't work. We know that, we've seen it. If we want trust, as Susan mentioned, if we want businesses to operate confidently that they're not going to lose their secrets, that people are not going to have their lives, their privacy invaded or data used against them, biases in artificial intelligence, all these things require some form of government regulation, supervision, control, and enforcement. But how do we do this in Canada while at the same time ensuring that, Canadian companies can do business abroad and foreign companies can do business in Canada, right? To me, this is almost the existential challenge when we talk about digital trade. Right? As I mentioned in my presentation, and it's also very clear in the report to say, well, yes, we can have the best infrastructure possible. We can have the best skills capacity possible. But if we can't get our data, our products, our services out of the country, or we can't get it into the country because of all these different regulatory frameworks, how are we going to achieve this? And right now, there are a lot of conversations about these things taking place all over the world, but where can we talk about this? A while ago, I remember Susan and I did a paper thinking that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was going to be the solution, and then the more we thought about it, like, well, maybe not. Susan talked about DIPA, this agreement that Canada has asked to join between New Zealand, Australia, and Singapore, which in a way is a step towards that, but is also quite, has its limitations. So from your perspectives, how do we do this? How do we, on the one hand, ensure that trade can happen, especially across borders, but that we have the right regulation standards to protect people, to protect businesses, to protect governments? Chantal.
Well, I'd like to jump on that just because I alluded to it, to what my 6 pillars. The 5th pillar is the cross-border data transfer regulation. Briefly, but I believe that is key. I understood that from Robert's presentation as well. And so let's look at what we're doing. So the current Bill C-27 modernizing PIPEDA affirms the fact that no other restriction to the transfer of personal data abroad is applied than ensuring it is protected in a comparable manner as when it stays here, and 2, to informing individuals, which raises the question as how does the Quebec Act fit into the Canadian approach when the Quebec Act subjects every transfer of personal data outside Quebec, not outside Canada, outside Quebec, and therefore also outside of Canada, to privacy impact assessments and written agreements. So there's a hurdle that I believe has been created in the Quebec legislation. There's, I believe, a good framework that is adopted in the federal legislation, which is, as Canada has always been of the view, number one, yes, you can cross, the data can go cross borders because that's the nature of digital trade. Two, you have to make sure you don't compromise its protection. You just mentioned a moment ago, Patrick, of sending the data in a state where the law enforcement authorities do have quite permissive access to the data. And thirdly, informing individuals because it is material to consent. So that's the governing framework I see around that.
Just maybe a few points on from
Robert.
more from a business perspective. Obviously, and you describe it well, Patrick, the objectives are sound, they are important, they are necessary, it has to be regulated, it has to be obviously privacy, personal data has to be protected. But often governments just don't have the tools to deal with that. And the compliance, what I will call the undesired effects, are very important and numerous for businesses. I think at the macro level, I see, and CG has done a lot of good work on this, international governance problems on how you how you put all these policies together, that you create a level playing field internationally, so that as a country that is a first mover is not penalized from a global perspective on trade. That seems to me like something that Canada should not do. And a lot of what you said applies for what the global crisis that is happening on energy right now. Canada has put forward a very necessary but very rigid carbon pricing system and carbon policies that sometimes on the regulatory side puts a lot of onus on companies to do trade effectively. So I think we have to be conscious of that. The compliance cost and the compliance aspect of this is very onerous. Just the Quebec-Canada example that Chantal mentioned, and I know a lot of lawyers make good money with this, but for business, it's a big headache and it's a big problem. Again, not questioning the necessity to move forward with this. I think everybody's on board, but it can create a lot of havoc and a lot of uncertainty. This is at the end of the day all about competitiveness and how Canada situates itself in the global environment. We need to be smart about this, and we need to move with partners. Otherwise, if we go alone as Boy Scout and do our own stuff thinking we are solving the world's problem, I think we can end up with a lot of big problems for businesses.
Can I just
Susan.
add to Robert's point? So Canada is in a catch-22. It could focus multilaterally, but it doesn't have the market clout to do that, really. So it can't really lead, although I think it has tried. On the other hand, I am really disappointed that Canada has not thought in a anticipatory manner about the nature of data and its implications for not just the economy, but the polity. So, for example, various governments have done various things along these lines, but Canada, I'm thinking, could be doing so much more, since it does have, I would say, a competitive advantage in AI based on its research and its immigration policies, where it doesn't have to have size in AI to have clout, and yet it doesn't have that clout. Yet, given its focus on AI, I'm just using AI as an example, it is shocking to me that Canada hasn't thought, what would a trade policy for AI look like? No nation that I can find has thought about that. I mean, if you want to have, an advantage in AI, I would think that you would think about the role of data in AI. So synthetic data, various types of data, that's one thing. So, I'm kind of shocked that Canada has not thought comprehensively about that. The other thing is, and AI protectionism, which, just as an aside, almost every government is subsidizing its AI sector and the components leading to it. They have insane policies related to domestic sovereignty regarding data. which is, makes no sense if you believe the data is a public good. I am deeply worried about, I'm going to be controversial here, so Chantal, you should slap me down. I'll focus on privacy. That is not the only human right that is affected when you have inadequate data protection. Privacy is fundamental to freedom of association and freedom of speech online. And it drives me mad when, press people or civil society people call me and say they want to talk about privacy when, to me, we have to talk about the associated rights on which, privacy gives you that. How does that relate to disinformation? I just had a conversation with a friend of mine regarding USTR's digital trade policy. And I told him that I thought it was insane that the United States has been trying to lead in internet related policy. So it has nothing to say about data and does not coordinate that. Another example, gig workers. Are we all going to be gig workers in the future? It sure looks like more and more firms are, letting their employees work from home, but they are also loosening their obligations to those employees around the world. And I see no digital trade policy that takes this into account, and a forward-thinking trade policy should. So that's not a criticism of Patrick's paper, which again is excellent, but it is a criticism of the Canadian government, which should be, given, just again, going back to the AI leadership and focus through Innovation Canada. It's just inconsistent. Chantal, you ready to ask me?
Yeah, yes, because I'm really intrigued by your comments in light of the fact that Bill C-27 also includes an Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which seeks precisely to frame the use of AI for its maximal potential. It even addresses, for example, the issue of biased outputs. Which no other legislation does. For example, the GDPR does address AI in relation to transparency. The Quebec legislation addresses AI in relation to transparency. And also the Quebec legislation, by creating the right for the individual to obtain the personal information that was used in the AI process, is in a way giving some legs to the protection against algorithmic bias. But in the Artificial Intelligence Data Governance Act, as it is proposed, it is actually mentioned as a provision with a framework to govern it. So I'm not quite sure.
But some sound cool. Right? It's an idea that may pass, but it's not there yet. And so
well, we have an act before the House, and it will follow its course. It will be adopted, and we'll have a
just
regime.
like the digital charter legislation.
No, the digital charter legislation there's modernizes the Privacy Act. Okay. In addition, there are 3 bills in Bill C-27. One is the Digital Privacy Act, with Digital Charter Act, which seeks to modernize our federal privacy legislation for the private sector. Second one creates a tribunal to review the recommendation of fines against organizations for violation of privacy. The third bill is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. It creates a data commissioner. It creates a regulatory framework. And I say framework in the sense that it will be filled by regulation. It's more like a structure at the point to regulate the use of AI.
Susan, you want to respond?
Yeah. So again, all I'm saying is I can only comment on that which exists, not that which might be. The same in the United States. You know, we have an election coming up, which may very much affect the chances of having personal data protection legislation at the national level in the United States. My gut is it's going to go nowhere if it's a divided House and Senate. I don't, until something exists. I mean, Chantal, I think this is great. It's a start. It's a big maybe. That's my point. And I don't think Canadian, like I don't see global affairs actually leading on the international connections of this, but I appreciate what you're saying. You're saying, and this is a fair criticism of what I just said, that, you know, Canada is moving in the right direction. It has proposed legislation, and that legislation is really important. But I'm saying it doesn't exist yet.
No, but I think to Chantal's point, you know, obviously in the US, it's a big question mark. I think in Canada at this point, you know, unless there is a surprise election call in the next months, which, you know, I think everyone would be very surprised if that happened. I think Bill C-27 in some form or another will likely pass. We hope so. I mean, certainly it's one of the recommendations of the report is to do so the sooner the better, given the uncertainty that is created, especially with regards to our adequacy status with the EU. I think certainly the addition in this new version of because there was Bill C-11 that died with the previous election, Bill C-27 now as this third element on AI and data, which wasn't there. And I think that's maybe the most interesting contribution that Canada is doing. We'll have to see how, whether it will serve as a model. But the big question, and I think this goes back a bit to Susan's point, is how it will interface with digital trade and digital trade commitments, right? I'm just wondering, and I haven't looked into this more deeply, but you know, certainly in both the CUSMA or USMCA, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, and in TPP, you know, there is a provision on you know, requirement for information, you know, kind of the algorithms and the sources of AI models, right? That if it's a requirement of doing business, well, according to these agreements, it's not supposed to be, right? Like governments cannot require that companies share in a way the inner workings of their models. Now, I haven't looked at the data, the AI and Data Act, but if that kind of requirement is now, you know, we need transparency, we need to know how this thing works in order to make sure there's no bias, does that actually contravene the engagement or that the commitments that Canada has taken with the US, for instance, in CUSMA? I don't know, maybe Chantal has some ideas about that. But I think, again, it goes back to this notion that sometimes, you know, Canada has taken commitments in its trade agreements on a number of things, while at the same time not having decided what it's doing nationally. And this goes for many, many countries, right? I think in a way, a lot of the discussion that we're having right now with regards to Canada applies to a number of countries in terms of, you know, different parts of the system going forward. Oh, we need to protect data. Well, how does it relate to digital trade and ensuring we can do that, or AI governance? And I think that's really, you know, at the core of the challenges that we're facing right now, is that yes, you can put in place regulations and protect people and protect businesses and protect governments, but you know, if then you take commitments to say, well, you know, how much can you really protect those things, right? And whether they would get challenged under certain trade agreements remains to be seen. Right? Maybe it'll never come to a dispute, but what if at some point, and this is something that I've been wondering about, what if at some point one of the trade partners, you know, whether the US says, no, you can't do that. You know, harmful content, you can't make it liable because you've taken commitments in the US and CUSMA or the USMCA that you can't make companies liable for it. Well, wait, we have a national legislation that now wants to do this. And ultimately it goes to some kind of panel of arbitrators, you know, 3 people who will say, here's what's legitimate and what is not. So to me, these are things that are the core of all this governance around digital trade and the regulatory environment, which I don't think we've fully grasped. I'd like to, Robert, I don't know if you want to add anything before. There are a few questions that maybe we can look at. Is there, do you want to respond to Chantal and Susan?
Just maybe the Tim Sargent, who I've had the pleasure to work with in government, has just asked a very good question, I think, about digital skills, both soft and hard. And given the fact that Canada does well on PSE attainment rate, but not necessarily well on STEM, I would say at the graduate level, I think this is something that we need to be more intentional about. This is complicated in Canada because of the FedProv conundrum and curriculum on education. But I would think certainly on research, certainly on when you look at the Israel model, for example, and the focus they put on STEM, I would think this is something very important. Same with skilled immigration. I think there should be an emphasis on this. Economic immigration is going to become more and more important going forward. Those are the skills we absolutely need in this economy. So I just want to say, I don't see you, Tim, say I agree with your question, with the importance of it. And I think as policymakers think about digital trade, they should think about this because it's kind of the beginning of the continuum.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And then I think this fits very well into the strategy's second pillar when we talk about capacity. I mean, yes, we talk about workers and you know, in the report I talk about some programs. Certainly the federal government, I haven't really looked at provincial programs which are also operating in that space. But yes, I didn't want to get into the education part of the discussion, but I think it is a very important thing, is how do we prepare in a way the next generations. I mean, they're certainly way more tech savvy than we are, I would think. But you know, do they have the right skills and the right capacity to you know, adopt and develop these technologies that ultimately would make Canada a digital trade powerhouse? There's Tequila Brooks who also talks about SMEs and how SMEs and micro enterprises can engage in the global trading environment, and talks about, you know, even specifically at artisans. I think this is, you know, it's certainly happening in developed or rich countries like Canada, where more and more you have individuals who, you know, artists or others who are using platforms, whether it's Shopify or Amazon or others, Alibaba in China. So a lot of people actually outside of China are using these platforms to conduct international trade, right? Because yeah, if you're small in a remote area, very difficult to conduct international trade on your own. But digitalization obviously makes that a lot easier, and that's in a way the goal, the aspiration. So far, how much is it happening? Difficult to say. I mean, Susan did talk about that we don't have good measurements. Data is kind of garbage on this at this point, although statistical agencies, as I mentioned, are working really hard to try to beef that up. And I think that speaks to Glenn Hodgson's question about you know, solid understanding of what's going on. We're just starting, you know, so that's one of the key challenges, is that we don't have data. I was just talking to someone who's at the WTO, and the WTO has done kind of surveys, sent surveys to about 2,000 companies to try to get a sense of what kind of data they're transferring, data flows, cross-border data flows, and only apparently 84 responded. Maybe I'm not supposed to share that publicly, but you know, a very small number. And the big question is, well, is it because they don't want to share that information? Is it because they don't know? So you know, it's a real challenge out there to get information on digital trade, on data flows, and that's, you know, in parallel. When we're talking about, you know, the governance aspect, this is also part of it. Although, you know, WTO, IMF, OECD, and UNCTAD are working very hard on this. But, you know, the big question is how much, for instance, businesses are willing to cooperate in making their information, their data, and about digital trade possible. I just want a quick question. I'm looking at Carl Easton. Bill C-11, online digital media will help Canada be more competitive, or will this hinder Canada's competition with digital trade? Anyone wants to take a quick task, you know, at Bill C-11 on online digital media. Is that something anyone, Chantal, do you want to say something quickly? Have you been following Bill C-11?
Yes, absolutely. But my angle is too narrow to address the question the way it has been framed. I think the question was much broader.
Yeah, so I think we'll leave that
Absolutely.
aside. It's a big question. It's a big debate. It's not clear how it's going to affect certainly digital trade, maybe in terms of, you know, people having maybe some companies that provide news media or news from outside Canada might decide that they don't want to sell their services in Canada as a result. We'll have to see. I think that remains to be said. So I'll stop here. This was to be a short and sweet conversations. We could probably continue for days to discuss this, but I want to thank Susan, Robert, and Chantal for accepting my invitation to bring their expertise, bring their insights, and their vast knowledge to this discussion about digital trade for Canada and obviously beyond, and for people online who have listened to us and hopefully found the discussion and the exchange valuable and provocative. And so thank you very much. And yes, please go and read the report. And if you don't have a lot of time, at least the policy brief. If you want a copy, just send me an email and I'll be happy to send it to you. And then when it's online, we'll share it more broadly through social media. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to our discussants, and we'll speak soon, hopefully, but it's certainly an issue and a file that's not going away quickly anyhow. So thank you very much. Merci à tous. Au revoir.
Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Merci.
Congratulations and really good job. Really
Thanks,
good.
Susan. Thank you very
That's
much.
what parents say. You did a, that's what I mean to say. I'll shut up
Thank
now.
you.
Bye,
All
everybody.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.